Eric? We're going to start in about 20 seconds, everybody. Be prepared for the bell. Eric? Turn off your cell phones, everybody. With that, welcome to another Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It's fun to be back from Fiji. I should say bula to everybody. Bula. Let's see. A little bit about future speakers. Eric, you're going to get that on the screen, please, right? In December, Michael Ellis will be here, and Joe Copenhagen will be here, and then we'll have the annual Father-Son Christmas Luncheon. That's a great, fun event. We have a character artist here to take pictures of you to remind you later on of what your chin used to look like. In November, we'll have all about the Delta Ditch Run and Sparrowhawk on the Horizon and Barons of the Sea, and we'll have a talk all about the new Treasure Island Museum. And in September, here we go, Brandon Southwall and his colleague Bob Meserek will be here to talk all about preventing ship strikes of whales, because that's getting to be quite a bad thing. They'll tell you the number of them. It'll alarm you. The number keeps going up. In September, also, we'll get to hear about the big boat series that's coming up. It's the biggest big boat series on the West Coast this year, and they'll have over 80 boats. And there's a new classic division, which will be fun. I'm racing in the new classic division, boats that are 50 years old or so. Mort Beebe will be here to talk all about his recent Hong Kong trip. He's the noted photographer that did the book called San Francisco that the Chamber of Commerce has handed out for years. And at the end of September, Michael Brodsky will be here to talk about how we stopped the number of tunnels. There were 2, there now will be 1. He's trying to stop just the 1 from choking off our Delta. And next week, Chip Merlin will be here to talk all about the Transpac. He just took 3rd in the classic, beautiful yacht, Merlin. So, we've got lots of great talks coming up. A little bit about Fiji. 85 of us went on a small, called a mini liner. Like a liner, like a big ship, like a 700 or 900 foot liner, but really only 250 feet long, 4 decks. Really, really a fun kind of a format for a cruise, a Commodore's cruise. Paul Heineken and Janet did a masterful job. We snorkeled and dove, scuba diving, and during the night, the ship would go from island to island to island. So it was very practical, real fun. All the food was prepared by the ship. And what's interesting about Fiji is if you race in the ocean, you can go miles and miles with no waves because it's it's got a big ring of reefs all around it. I've never been at sea for a week in my life with less waves. And by less waves, I mean, we never really saw much more than this. You look at the bay right now, and we saw literally as little waves as that and less all the time. I never saw a 2-foot sea, never got to 2 feet because the reefs kind of stop all the sea state. It was real adventure. A little bit about our speaker today. So it's always interesting to listen to how people begin their sailing world. And Johnny, at your screen. In this particular case, she was a water skier before she was doing anything else. So she water skied at 16 years of age in our Clear Lake and in Oregon. And then at 21 years of age, she can remember fishing on a fishing boat with her pop. And then in 1970, she started sailing with Dr. George Degnan. I raced against George Degnan. I raced against him in the 70s, and it's likely we were racing on the same race course in those days. She sailed in an IOD, imagine that, beautiful, masterful class, and she raced on his boat Quick Step when I raced on a bunch of different ones, Minuteman and so on, before I got my own. And she had this idea, that she would be able to write as she got to be a adult. But it wasn't until she received a batch of postcards that she got the real bug to write. This is her second book published. Her third one is at the publisher right now. This is the first of 2 books she's had published, I should say. And it's a masterful, fun story, and I'm looking forward to listening to Leslie's story about how she wrote the book and the whole story around it about a famous president, Teddy Roosevelt. So with that, the author, Leslie Compton. Leslie, come on up.
And thank you, Ron and Kathy, for finding me. This is great. I really appreciate this opportunity. And you're right. How did I begin getting involved in Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet? And that happened when I was 10 years old. I received a box of postcards from my grandfather's cousin, whom I had never met. I believe nobody wanted them. I think that's why I got them. But they were fascinating because they were pictures from around the world, places I'd never heard of, certainly places I knew I'd never visit. So I carried them around with me through different moves. And then in my own apartment, I had my first teaching job, and I went to an antique fair out in Concord, actually. And here was a man who was selling amazing postcards. And I said, oh, I can make some money. Because what am I going to do with these postcards in a box? I mean, at this point, what am I going to do? So I invited him to my house. And I said, and he was very good. He spent about an hour looking over all the postcards. And he said, well, there are a couple of them that are worth about 25 cents. Some are worth 5. Most of them aren't worth anything. And what dawned on me, thank goodness, was that these came from my family. Even though I didn't know the owner of the postcards, they were from my family. And I thought, I need to dig into this further before I give them away or sell them. So I issued them out the door. And then I began getting interested in postcards and the history of postcards myself. To find out, and I'm going to pass these around, that the postcards originally in the United States were published by the government in 1898. And 1898 through 1919 became a real craze for collecting postcards. And originally they had an undivided back. This postcard that you see, okay, you don't see it up there, do you? Okay, help me. I'm going to pass this around so that you can see what an undivided back looks like. I can't scan an undivided back because there's nothing there. Okay, there we are. You can see on the pictures that all of the postcards during that period of time had an area that you could write on. If you only could write the address on the back of the card. Anything else, it was in the trash. So you had all of the postcards contained an area on the back. Publishers got into postcard collecting as well. And the battleships were a show of power in every single nation. How many battleships? England was first. And depending on who you read, France and Germany came in second. So it was the show of power. We were the only country that had white battleships. This I'm showing is also divided back. And if you can look I have a pointer, at least it goes to one. You can see right here, that's brass filigree on every one of the ships. In the center, and I have that one also, that I'll pass around so you can see it a little bit better. Thanks. Right here in the center, all the ships were named after states except the Kearsarge, which was named after a battleship in the Civil War. In the center was the emblem of that state. And of course, this gave the sailors a job to do every day. They had to, take care of that brass. This is on dry dock, obviously. This is the armor of every battleship. And we were not making steel that was appropriate for our battleships. So we ended up importing, thank you, steel from France, which was an alloy of nickel and steel in order to have the appropriate armor to secure our ships. So as the publishers got involved with cards, they became like our collectible baseball cards when we were younger. You wanted to get the whole set, and I got the bit by the bug as well. So I was on the internet and everything else trying to get that last card for the set, because every publisher had their own imprint. This publisher, every card, whether it be a cruiser or a battleship, of course, had that emblem. This is also another battleship, another publisher. And this one's fun. I have to show this one. It's Oregon. That's where I live. Can you see this area? This publisher, on every one of these cards, he hand glued glitter. This is all glitter, glitter, and there's even glitter in the water. So I don't bring that to show people. Eventually all of that will go. But every single postcard that you could buy had the glitter. This is another publisher, and every one of his postcards had the framing. Then people got involved so that they filmed and took a picture of the crew for every single battleship. And if you look closely, right here, right there, there's a goat. Every single battleship had animals. The Connecticut actually had a pet pig. We had several dogs, several cats, and as you will see as I go through with the Great White Fleet, there were many animals that were added. So I became interested in postcards, but I still didn't understand where these cards came from, because my postcards only had writing on the back. They obviously had come in an envelope, but they did have the dates, and they were from 1907 to 1910, actually. So I was living in New York at the time, and there was an ad in a paper saying that there was a postcard club that was originating. Please come with something to show and tell. So I thought this is a good time to be able to learn about these postcards. And I took about 25 of them, and I still remember the look on a couple people's faces. I said, these are from the Great White Fleet. I said, the Great White what? And almost everybody I talk to says that. They talked to me about it, and they said, how many do you have? And I said, about 300. And they said, okay, you have to write a book. And that was in 1996, quite a while ago. So I began researching. I had to figure out where these cards came from, who had written them, because there were only initials on the cards. And so I was very fortunate to live on the East Coast. That meant I got the Boston Library, the Manhattan Library. I could practically put my sleeping bag and stay several days. I also had Annapolis. I had the Smithsonian Institute and the Library of Congress. Then I took a trip, went to the West Coast, from San Diego up to Seattle, visiting every library and every museum. Plus the internet. eBay had just come. And so I was able to contact other people who were also interested in the Great White Fleet and would send me the pictures of their cards. Sorry, this really dates me, on floppies. So that's how I became fascinated. And it started to be a history type book. And then I actually had a dream one night. And I said, no, that's boring. Nobody wants to read that. Maurice, my sailor, he needs to tell this story. So I used all of his writing from the postcards, plus my research, and put everything in his words, writing to Minnie, who was Minnie Camp, who he went to school with in Kentucky. This became a love story because he starts off with Dear Minnie. They meet in Los Angeles, San Pedro, while he's on leave, and after that it becomes Dearest Minnie. And he does propose while he's in Australia. So that's fun to find out. And give you an idea of how the Great White Fleet actually originated. Roosevelt was, of course, president at that time. But even before that, as Secretary of State in 1897, he said the most effective way to achieve peace was to prepare for war. And that meant expanding the Navy. This was his biggest feat that he was most proud of in his political career. After the war with Spain, America then took control of Cuba to ensure the safety of the Panama Canal that was under construction. Also Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and then a year later annexed the Hawaiian Islands. America became concerned about the security because the Panama Canal would mean that they were no longer isolated. We did not have fleets at this time. All the battleships were independent of one another, hugging the shores. So it was Roosevelt who said, okay, we need to have an Atlantic fleet and we need to have a Pacific fleet because he was sure that Japan would get interested in the Hawaiian Islands and Guam. And he wanted to make sure that we were secure in that area. Again, all nations felt battleships were a show of power. So European navies went from port to port and created fleet weeks and fleet days, which San Francisco has every Columbus holiday. And so they would come with different formations of their ships, come to shore, spreading water on all the spectators. But this was to get support for more ships and a larger navy. We didn't do that. So Roosevelt, again, to his personality, he didn't like the fact that we were not number one in how many ships we had. So he decided he would be number one by we would go on a world cruise. Never before had that been proposed, and of course, never before has it happened again. So he wanted to go on the world cruise, and what was the big detrimental factor here is that one of the battleships, traveling at about 10 knots, used 90 tons of coal a day. That's why the battleships hugged the shores, because how else are they going to get their coal? He was sure that this could be taken care of. It meant every 10 days to 2 weeks they had to find a coaling station, or one of the problems on this particular cruise was that we didn't have enough colliers, so we had to hire colliers from other countries. So in 1904, we had war with Russia and Japan. Japan won the war, and Roosevelt, on this postcard, he won a Nobel Prize because he initiated the peace treaty. However, Japan was not happy with him because Japan wanted Russia to pay for the damages that they had done to Japanese Navy, even though Russia lost. And Roosevelt said, no way. So now Japan's upset with us. And lo and behold, a little bit later, San Francisco passed a law that said we have too many, and I will quote, Orientals here, and that we are now going to say they have to attend their own schools. They could not attend public school. Japan's further upset with us. So Roosevelt stepped in, of course, and changed that law. But the newspapers were constantly saying, we are going to have war with Japan. And so there was just this tension that was brewing. Not a good thing. Roosevelt was sure this wasn't going to happen by what he found out. He said, no, this is going to be okay. He said, I want a cruise. I want a world tour. He said, I want all the failures and blunders and shortcomings to be made apparent in time of peace and not in time of war. And he said the Navy needed practice in navigations, communications, coal consumption, crew stamina, and fleet maneuvering. He wanted to impress the foreign navies. He wanted also America to feel the strength in their Navy. The officers were not pleased. We can accomplish this right here close to shore. The Congress and the Joint Board of Army and Navy, they were not pleased either. Roosevelt, those of you who understand Roosevelt, and I quote, I am the commander-in-chief. My decision is absolute in this matter. Said there's enough money to get them to San Francisco, and if you don't allocate further funds, they can just stay there. That was that. He kept it a secret that he was actually going to have a world cruise because they didn't want it. Okay, we're just going to go to San Francisco. It was much later, by the way, that it was called the Great White Fleet. It was always called the Atlantic Fleet because he got together the 20 out of 28 ships in the Atlantic Fleet. 16 he felt could make it. Not all of them did, but I'm going to show you just a couple more so that you get a feeling for the publishers and how they managed to make frames and how they all became so popular and collectible. This particular publisher is fun because every one of his cards has a different flower surrounding the battleship or cruiser, and it's either an oblong or square. It's always different. So now that we have the ships from the Atlantic Fleet, now we have to pick a commander. And Robley Evans was someone that was a friend of Roosevelt's. This is a picture of a postcard of Robley Evans shortly after the Civil War. And he was wounded several times in the Civil War and suffered with a great deal of pain the rest of his life. This is the young picture, a little older. And this is what he looked like taking command of the 16 battleships. One of the things that we learned from all of this cruise was the fact that our officers were between 7 and 15 years older than officers of the same rank in other navies. And this really became a deterrent because on many of the ports, the officers sometimes changed uniform 8 times and went to as many banquets, teas, dinners, luncheons, and gave as many talks, had to eat as much and drink as much wine. So it was very, for somebody who was in their 60s, that was not easy. So then they had a campaign to choose recruit the men because the Navy had a habit, they had a reputation that their sailors were brawlers, alcoholics. So they started recruiting, and they recruited in the Midwest and West because this is what Roosevelt wanted. He wanted a robust frame, intelligent, perfectly sound and healthy constitution, free from any physical defects or malformation. And that meant that even a young man who happened to have acne was turned down, because Roosevelt wanted the men to look like my cover of my book, rosy cheeked. He wanted to impress the other nations that that's the way all our people looked. So that also, they coined the phrase, join the Navy and see the world at this time. And there were about 3/4 of the people, the men who went to the offices to enlist, were turned down. They had to read and write as well. So then Roosevelt handpicked his newsmen to go on these ships. And he instructed them that they need all the information that they were to send to the United States had to be scrutinized by a certain officer, because they only could write about the positive aspects of this cruise. The wonderful games that they were playing and the matches, the rowboat matches, it didn't matter, but he could not write about any of the negative happenings. He also chose a postcard publisher, H.H. Stratton, whom I don't care for, and I'll show you why in a little bit. So now we're going to make things better on the ship. So we had higher pay than before, and every ship was had a sick bay, as you can see, carpentry shop, a tailor, a shoemaker, because you can see they had a parade at every port of about 3 to 5 miles. So they had to have a shoemaker. A sail making shop. Anybody know why they would have a sail making shop? No, it's target practice. So they take a raft. I have pictures in the book. They take a raft with sails out, and this is what they'd use for target practice. So this is a sick bay that you see. They had a print shop, and this particular postcard, because it's a sepia toned, this is what I call a private card. There's only one of those. The sailors would end up taking pictures during this cruise, and they would be portable, like kiosks, when they would come into port, give the film to that person, and postcards would be created from their film. So then they'd mail them back home. So every time I get a sepia card, I get very excited because I know that's the only one around. This is also a sepia card. They had plays. Now, bear in mind, these are all men, even though they're dressed in dresses. They had portable stage. Every ship had 1 to 4 pianos. Every ship had a band and an orchestra. And I have to put this in, even though this is not the Great White Fleet. You see, the sailor who wrote these postcards was a musician, first-class musician, and he played the horn. Now, that's all I know, whether it's French horn, I assume it's French horn. Now, I was a music teacher. Anybody in here played in the band in high school? Okay, good. Tell me what kind of, who wrote the music that's in this stand? Can you remember? Sousa. Yes. John Philip Sousa. I'm sure that's Sousa, because his music was, always came that short, so you could put it on a lyre with the horn, the trumpets. But look at how these men are sitting. I would not allow that when I was teaching music. Cross legs, slouching. Nope, can't happen. Can't happen. So, in December 12th, all 16 battleships went to Hampton Roads, Virginia. This is taken from the Hotel Chamberlain. And they formed 2 parallel lines of 8 battleships called the Line of Squadrons. We had 2 flagships, the Connecticut and the Minnesota. To the list of usual supplies were added pies, puddings, sacks of walnuts, and 15,000 pounds of chocolate bonbons for the Connecticut. And every sailor received a brand new Bible. We had 14,000 sailors on 16 ships. By the time the ships were loaded, remember the red armor that I showed you needs to show above the waterline. They did not. And so this was not publicized until long afterwards, because it meant that the ships were totally, they were not armed at all. In fact, some of the water came through the portholes. So this is Roosevelt's yacht. Looks just like yours out there, I'm sure. And the morning of the cruise, he invited the admirals to have breakfast with him. And it was at that time that he told them, "You're going around the world." No one, rumors were flying, but nobody knew that that's what was going to happen. You can see, again, this is a private card and smokestack burning the coal, heading out of Hampton Roads. And even though this postcard is pretty well beat up, I show it anyway because of the formation that you can see in the card. And look clear out into the horizon and you can see, again, maybe you can't see that here. I can see it on my computer. Right out here, you can barely see the ships because it was quite foggy that morning. The people on shore. This is a really cool card. Unfortunately, the resolution isn't what I would like because it's not my card. It was sent to me on a floppy. I could not afford this card. The most that I would spend on a card was $60. And this was way over the $60. It has a fold. I don't know if you can see it. So then it would fold the size of a postcard. But I like to show it because once they were out in sea, then they would practice these maneuvers, all different maneuvers, so that by the time they came into port, steaming at high speeds, drop anchor simultaneously, so that again, the spectators were totally splashed. This card I do have, and I recently saw this on eBay selling for $149. You see Robley Evans at one side, young Robley, and you see young Roosevelt on the other side. And when you pull that string, all 16 battleships unfold accordion style with their commanders. This is just one of the cards. There were so many cards that were produced for this particular historic event. This is not a postcard, but I like to show it so that you get a feel for where they're going. And I don't know where the best place to put this little arrow, but this is Hampton Roads. So because the Isthmus Canal was not completed, they had to go all around the Horn, come up this way. They spent about 2 weeks in Mexico with target practice, because they had to have target practice twice a year. Then they went over to Hawaii. They went to Australia, New Zealand. They went to Manila twice. Okay, Japan, China. Some of Europe went through Gibraltar to the Suez Canal, Gibraltar, and then back home in 14 months. This is not the Great White Fleet either. These next two cards were taken before this particular period, but it does show that the sailors had to wash their own, and the blues and the whites had to stay away from each other. You always made sure you did not hang blues on top of whites. And of course, the officers had their uniforms washed for them. Again, this is a private card. They also had to wash their hammocks. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is coaling, mainly because it was such an important issue. And it was amazing that it was not only a dirty job, but it was also considered a drill, because in wartime, they had to go as fast as possible. So the bands usually played a ragtime piece so that they'd get the people moving, the guys moving faster, and everybody took part in this. And what they did first was to sand the decks, because all the decks, of course, were of wood, railings and decks, to make sure that the coal dust did not scrape the wood. And then they would have the cranes that would take care of the sacks that were filled with the ash from the hold of the ship. And if they were in a foreign port, what you're seeing next to the ship is a lighter. And they would put the bags of ash on the lighter. And as a foreign country, the lighter would go out beyond the horizon and dump them. If they were in America, they wouldn't bother with a lighter. They would just dump the ash overboard. So after the hold was cleared out, the first division, which 4 ships, tied up alongside of the waiting colliers, and then the shovelers from each ship would go aboard the hot, humid holds, because many times it was like 130 to 150 degrees down there, and would fill a bag. And when the bag was 50 pounds, then it would be 800 pounds, then it would be hefted up to the ship. The coalers, the shovelers, were only allowed to be in that hold for 30 minutes before a new shift came because of the heat. So they had ice water waiting for them to cool them off. And this, even though I have 1911, this is before I knew what I had as far as postcards, and I started playing with them. It's my own writing. So you can see from up above on the crow's nest. This is how they looked when they finished coaling a ship. Now, dress code was relaxed. Uniforms, they didn't matter what you wore, but you could only see the whites of their eyes. They're breathing all of this coal dust. Amazing. This also, it was funny because my publisher said, "I'm sorry, I know you scanned this picture, but you're going to have to do it again because it's all blurry." And I said, "I know, it was an old camera that took the picture." These fellows moved. And by the end of the cruise, after 14 months, the 16 ships broke 280 shovels. Amazing. Here's another picture from another ship showing what the sailors look like at the end. Now, Robley Evans, as I said before, was wounded in the Civil War, and he was suffering greatly from those wounds. So what he did was he said, "Okay, I have to step down." So before they got to San Diego, he had the Yankton took him to Paso Robles so that he could rest there until he got to San Francisco. Meanwhile, everybody was buying postcards. They were buying boater toys. A chess game was created where the pawns were actually battleships. Women wore great big hats that were battleships. The canisters, battleships. This was just a great time to make money. This is also one of my postcards. Here they are coming through the Golden Gate. And it was foggy until right noontime, and the fog miraculously lifted. And they were joined by the Pacific Fleet, which meant that 42 ships came through on May 6th, 1908, through the Golden Gate. And when you open up this card, this is the picture that you see. You can let me know. So they were in San Francisco for quite some time, about 2 weeks. And at that point, they'd been to San Diego, San Pedro, Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, each time involving a parade. And each time, of course, a stop for fuel and supplies. The very first night, by then, the officers were entertained at the newly renovated Fairmont Hotel. The next day, they had a parade. Over 1 million people crowded the waterfront to see these ships come through the Golden Gate. And reading online, when you have the Fleet Week in October, more people came to see the Great White Fleet in 1908 than appear during the Fleet Week now. The railroads estimated that they brought in over 300,000 people. And it inaugurated the romance between Market Street and the Navy uniforms, and it began Fleet Week that you know. So here is the card showing all 42 battleships at night with their searchlights doing a wonderful show, and they did that every single night until they left for Washington. I think I missed that one, yes. So here are the men coming in to get ready for the parade. And this is a Stratton. Remember, Roosevelt had one publisher, postcard publisher, that he chose was Stratton. We always know Stratton because he always had a number somewhere on the card. This one happens to be right here. And his cards are not as crisp they are as other publishers. And this is another picture of that parade. Maurice hated parades. Playing his horn, marching for 5 hours, 5 miles. This again is a private card showing part of the parade, and of course decorations all over the place. This I really like. Private card, and here's Robley Evans, and he was pulled around in his wheelchair with a rope, attending to all the functions. And this is the mayor of San Francisco with him. So whoever took that picture, fabulous. Even though this is Seattle, I show this card because at every port, one ship played host while the rest of the ships would fuel. And that ship then had refreshments. The band played at one area, the orchestra played at another area. They would decorate the ship, and in Seattle, as in other places, they had a ferry that would take people out to the ship. The officers were not pleased about this because everybody wanted souvenirs. So they would confiscate spoons and cups, because remember, the women had nice big long skirts, so they could hide all kinds of things. And God forbid that one of the officers left something out of their bureau and they didn't put it in a drawer because these people were sneaking around all over the ship, and they'd be missing when they got back. Say nothing of the fact that when the sailors were on leave, they also wanted souvenirs, so they would pull their scarves, take that as a souvenir, pull off buttons, and that meant they had to pay 25 cents when they went back on board the ship. That wasn't fun. So they ended up, this is another card. This is funny, I teach a 6-week class on this. And they were saying, okay, what do these flags say? And I said, wow, I don't know, I'll do some research. Welcome. Says right down here at the bottom. They also had postcards of leather that could be mailed. Many postcards, San Francisco. This is another publisher and how he had everything. And of course, this is a great way to advertise. This one, the Cliff House had burned the year before. So this was imposed. And again, it's glued glitter that says your sailor boy arrived okay. This one's fun. It was taken at the Chutes, and that's at the Hyatt Ashbury area. Huge, huge recreational center. Los Angeles had the Chutes, and so did San Francisco. And of course, this was an area where you could have your picture taken. Roller coasters, everything. And again, advertisement, and those that have lived here long enough remember the smell of MJB coffee coming over the Bay Bridge. This is our sailor who took some of the pictures. They went to Oakland, they went to Santa Rosa, they went to Berkeley, always with a parade. Songs were written, poems were written. And one thing that also they did that copied Los Angeles, this is Los Angeles, they had a tour with cars. 238 cars, automobiles, were donated, and every 2.5 hours, 200 sailors would be taken from the ferry building to tour the San Francisco. And at one point, all 238 cars were traveling at the same time, 4 abreast, going down Ocean Avenue. And of course, all the sailors all of a sudden said, "Okay, go as fast as you can." Must have been a sight. And then the owners of the cars many times would take the sailors home for a nice home-cooked meal. They got this idea from Los Angeles. This is a fun card because the colors are all wrong. We have a gray ship and she's in white. It should be the other way around. Lake Merritt, this is Los Angeles, but Lake Merritt did the same thing. Okay, they had a huge big barbecue, and I talk about how much food that was used for the barbecue for the enlisted men, and they had 100 waiters in order to support all of this food. Once they got back to Hampton Roads, the sailors, the officers on board, as they're cruising around the world, said, "We've got to have gray ships. We can be seen all over the world." And they actually had gray paint aboard. But Roosevelt said no, because if we paint them now, we're going to be saying a different message. So as soon as they got back, all of the filigree was stripped, and they were painted what we know today as battleship gray. And they also had these almost looks like metal waste baskets that, from my understanding, made a difference as far as fire. So I show at the very end, this is Minnie. And it's Dearest Minnie, and that postcard was taken by her brother, who was a photographer, while they were in San Pedro. So, as quickly as I can. Okay. Thank you.
Carson, glass of water, please. Take that with you. Here you go. Take that with you. Put it right down there. This is yours.
Thank you.
Great. I don't know where you can put that. Put it right here. Okay. Aha. Welcome again to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Our speaker today, Leslie Compton, has written a wonderful book, Dearest Minnie. Thank you right there. All about the Great White Fleet's world tour. How, if at all, was America changed by the tour?
Absolutely it was. Again, the age of the officers changed. Okay. The age of the officers changed greatly, and we learned about coaling. We learned that and of course, when the ships took off, they were already antiquated because England had already produced and launched the Dreadnought in 1906, which was a combination of coal and I got in my notes, different energy. So it wasn't dependent upon coal entirely. And when the Great White Fleet, those ships got returned, then we began producing our own.
So do you know, were these steamships powered by burning coal? Is that how they operated?
Correct. It was all coal.
Steamships, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, postcards. So how long have you been collecting postcards before this and so on?
I became a real collector of postcards probably in the early 1990s.
How many do you have?
I sold a lot of them on eBay, but
have you made profit on these?
I did originally. I don't do that anymore, though. Yeah, I don't do it anymore. But I had thousands of postcards. I moved around the country about every 3 years, so it was interesting to me. I have a minor in history and a major in music, but I was interested in the history of the new area, the new state where we were living. And one of the great ways was to buy old postcards and learn about the area that way.
So do you write postcards when you're away?
No, I don't.
So did this cause, was there any particular, did more postcards get written because of this, because of the Great White Fleet going around the
Oh,
world?
absolutely. In fact, I gave a talk at a historical society last year, and she showed me a brochure that postcard collectors around the turn of the century actually were assigned a number, and you would be published in this pamphlet. And so if you wanted a postcard, say, from Philadelphia, and you lived here in Oakland or San Francisco, California, you'd write to number 67. In other words, you became anonymous. So you write to 67, I'm 28, can we exchange postcards? I'll send you one of mine, you send me. Because people didn't travel around the turn of the century. Nobody was picking up and moving. Companies were not moving people across country either. So this was the way that they could add, because they had beautiful albums that were created. In fact, one of the albums that I had, the front was inlaid with abalone shell in a form of a rose. And they would sit on special tables in their parlor.
And so what did postcards cost in those days?
5 cents.
5 cents. And what
5
did
cents.
postage cost?
That was usually 2 cents.
With a little 2-cent stamp.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so where did postcards start? Do you know much about the history of postcards?
Originally Germany before 1898, and it wasn't until about 5 years later that the United States began, the government of the United States began publishing postcards. And of course, very soon after that, it was, private publishers said this is a way we could make some money, and they took over.
So less than 10 years before the tour. So this sounds like it was like new technology in a way.
Certainly, because now we've got color on the postcards. We didn't have color in our regular film.
So those original postcards were not color?
They were, the ones that I have, absolutely.
Okay. So now, what's the average price? First, how many postcards did you said at one time you had thousands? How many?
I would say so.
Thousands?
I would say so.
And you've tapered down your inventory?
Oh, I have.
Why?
Well, it was interesting because I went through and decided I want the ship. I have a special book for all the ships. I want the Great White Fleet, and I want other places that I have lived, but some things I'm not interested in. As I've gotten older, I've pared down a lot of things, postcards being one of them.
Now, you mentioned that the cannons were not in the portholes or armed to go through portholes. Were any of the ships armed?
Oh, they all were.
They all were armed.
Absolutely. Every time they came into a foreign port, they had to give a 21-gun salute, and for the president of that company. And that salute...
Company? What do you mean?
Country, sorry. And that salute was $50,000.
Cost us.
That's cost them in 1908.
Of
And
21 guns from each of the 16?
That's correct.
Okay. Of each of the 16 battleships?
That's correct. And so 50,000 was Roosevelt's salary. So every time they went to a country, there was $50,000 just with the
What
saluting.
was the overall cost of the tour? Do you have any numbers?
I do. I have all the numbers in my book.
You can tell us. We won't tell
Oh,
anyone.
you think I have those at the top of my head? There's no way.
So
I have how much it cost for the coal, how many pounds of coal were used. I have all of those statistics.
So in reality, this was just one large 14-month-long public relations activity?
Correct.
The word junket comes to mind?
But also, for Roosevelt, it meant, see, we can do something that the rest of the world cannot do. We are powerful and wonderful.
So essentially, you're saying it was a company-wide, an American public relations activity.
Correct.
Now, I'm going to keep asking questions until I see a hand go up, and Paul Kamen will bring the microphone to you. So let's see. During this period, as Roosevelt was going around the world, how often would he be on the ships, and how would he get there?
Oh, no, he was never on any of the ships.
Never.
He was on his Mayflower, the yacht. And he insisted that the 16 ships must return on Washington's birthday to have a nice big parade, because from beginning with President Washington, the inauguration was always the 1st of March because of the weather. We couldn't count on the weather. So with Roosevelt and Taft, the inauguration was March 1st. And Roosevelt had an African safari planned. And he wanted to make sure that the fleet returned to Hampton Roads so that he could keep his plans for the safari.
And
Yes, a question from the audience.
That's a question I had. How much he spent 14 months on the water?
No.
Roosevelt?
No. He never joined the ship.
He never joined the
Sure.
battleships. No. Just the men.
So he just went out the first day on that fancy
That's
yacht.
correct. And then he also greeted them when they came back to Hampton Roads.
Great. You said there were 14,000 troops on 16 battleships. And otherwise, you said there were other boats at different times. It sounded like there was a 4-to-1 range of supporting boats and battleships themselves.
Correct.
More than
There were
16.
cruisers that went ahead of the battleships. They were always called the eyes of the fleet because it was important. They had German ships following them, Japanese ships following them, English ships, spies. They had spies all over, and so they had to make sure that they were secure.
So that was the question. So there was no episode of any foreign flare up or anything as we paraded around.
No, there
with
was
our
not.
ships. Okay.
Mm-mm.
Great. Yes.
So that was basically my question. So how was the reception in all these countries? And were there any mishaps?
The only
collisions?
reception that was poor was in Trinidad, which was their first stop. And that was a British-owned occupation country. And England and America were not on good terms at that point. England, if you recall, that had been kind of our foe, for years and years and years. And England also had an alliance with Japan. And we were having some problems with Japan. In fact, Roosevelt was concerned that if we had a war with Japan, would England side with Japan or would England side with us? And Roosevelt said to England, if you side with Japan, we're going to take over Canada.
So why didn't we? I'm sorry. We could use it now, global warming and all. Paul Kamen.
In doing my due diligence and reading up on the Great White Fleet, there are a lot of references to music that was played. I was able to find the MP3 of the song "The Girl I Left Behind Me," which was a surprisingly familiar folk tune. I was able to find the MP3 for the Cornell fight song, which was played when they arrived in Peru. But there was a custom dance number written by a Peruvian composer named Cesar Panizo called "The White Squadron," and I couldn't find any reference to that other than in the Wikipedia description of the fleet. Can you point me to some place that would shed some light on where that tune might exist, either in sheet music or as an MP3?
I wish I could.
Shouldn't you be playing a Sousa March as a background to the whole presentation?
Yeah.
We want to give Paul the award always for the most arcane question. He wins the award.
No, but not.
It takes a genius to ask a question with this much detail.
Yeah, but every time I give a talk on the Great White Fleet, I always learn something from someone. One of the things, and of course, remember this is a six-week class that I give, but in San Diego, the officers were met by their wives. Their wives read every day in the newspaper about the exciting balls and teas and everything their husbands were attending. And they thought, okay, I want to be part of this too. So they took a train from the East Coast, met them in San Diego, and some of them had 3 trunkfuls of ball gowns. And then they had such a good time that they hired German line, the Brennan, to take them follow the cruise for the rest of the tour. The officers weren't real happy about that.
Oops.
Whoops. Yeah, whoops. But interesting enough, someone that I gave this talk to who had just retired from the Navy, he said, you know, they still do the same thing.
So
I think there's a parallel thread here of all the music that was written and performed for this cruise that goes along with the postcards.
Yeah, the Girl I Left Behind was played when they were leaving Hampton Roads. Every band on each one of the ships played that.
So could you see any discernible change, i.e. evolution, in Teddy Roosevelt because of and as a result of this tour? He evolved as a human being from being, you know, a guy who shot wild animals to a conservationist, to one who didn't care about the use of coal all around the world, to one who cared a lot about national parks and became anti-pollution supporter. So did you notice any change in him during the period of and because of the tour?
No, because I wasn't concentrating so much on him. And because he, you know, right after the tour, he left office. He ran for president again 4 years later, but he left the office. And yeah, I found it interesting. PBS had a special on the Roosevelts a couple years ago, and the Great White Fleet, this whole cruise, was never even mentioned. And yet in Teddy Roosevelt's autobiography, he points this as one of his best highlight in his political career. So I don't know, I was a little disappointed it wasn't mentioned.
How long did it take you to write the book?
It took me 6 years of research and then 2 more years to put it all together.
So in high school, in English class, what kind of student were you?
To be honest, I was not a good student. I'm dyslexic, and therefore I had a great deal of trouble with writing and reading. So that's one of the reasons why I chose teaching. I figured that I could give a lot to other people who had learning problems, but yet were intelligent. And because of the computer, became enthralled with writing, because all of a sudden, I was always a very good typist, but all of a sudden, red would come up if I misspelled because I couldn't spell. And this encouraged me that indeed I could go forward in what I wanted to do, which was to write.
Did the size of the Navy expand during this tour and or during Roosevelt's term, do you know?
It did slightly, because we ended up in the recruiting situation when we were recruiting the sailors, the blue jackets they were called. We recruited 10,000 men, 4,000 including Maurice, my sailor on the USS Virginia. This was his second tour of duty. He took the second tour because he learned that they were going to go to San Francisco, and that meant that he could probably see his lifelong girlfriend, Minnie. But 10,000 men, so it was increased. But after that, you know, all these battleships, by 1923, they were gone. They were either used for target practice or they were scrapped for metal.
Did you say what was the original reason they were painted white? What was the purpose?
I don't know the purpose. We've always had battleships that were white from the very, very beginning.
But they went gray after this, you said?
Yes, yes.
That's when we started with Battleship Gray. Okay.
They went that gray because that's how all of the other nations had their ships, and we could be spotted. See, this is the first time our ships actually were sailing across oceans, and now they could be spotted 6 miles out.
So now lots of people have ideas about books. Lots of people have the ability to write, but you know, you're one of a few who actually have written now 3 books. You've got 2 published, 1 about to be published. Talk a little bit about your writing process, please.
Well, I write nonfiction.
When do you start in the morning? How do you get up and all that? The process.
The process probably goes on all night.
Okay.
You know, and I will jot some.
So you'll wake up
down.
and write something?
Yes, I do. Some notes.
Do you type or do you handwrite it?
When I wake up, it's handwritten. Just some notes. Oh, I should have thought about that. Oh, I hadn't thought about that one. Oh, I had to research this. Oh, don't forget to go online and check this out.
So are you writing these on a lined piece of tablet next to your bed?
I am. I
In the
am.
morning, you use those, and those kind of get you rolling?
They do. They do.
What time do you, give us the day in the life. What time do you wake up to start doing it?
I wake up fairly early depending on the sun, and then I go out for a walk, about a 3 to 4 mile walk. Come back in. You want my whole routine here?
Yes, yes.
Come back in, have a cup of coffee, and read. I love to read. And then I can shower and get cleaned up, and then I'm ready for my day. And I'm at the computer writing for about 2 to 3 hours in the morning, and about 2 to 3 hours. This summer it's been longer than that because this third book, I needed to get to my publisher by the 1st of August. So for about 2 months, it was like 8 hours sitting at the computer, but that's unusual.
So in the morning, when do you actually sit and start after this morning routine?
About 10 o'clock.
10 a.m. And when do you cut it off?
I cut it off by 5.
At 5 o'clock, you say
That's it.
that?
That's it. Glass of wine time.
What about editing?
I edit, and also my publisher edits, and then we have what we call advanced copies, and usually that's 5 books I don't have to pay for. And we find people, like with the Great White Fleet, we found people that were retired Navy or something having to do with history, having to do with naval history, to read them for the content as well as for the English.
So what's the role of the editor in your case? How does that editor change your work?
The role of the editor for me is content, because I'm writing nonfiction, to make sure that I have everything correct. I had an editor with the Great White Fleet. It was James Reckner, who is a retired admiral who has written several books on naval history. And I contacted him. I've used him in my bibliography. I have a long bibliography in the end of this book. And he said, I'd be happy to read over your book, because I wanted to make sure that what I had researched was absolutely correct. So he did that. I sent my book originally to Annapolis, and they had 5 readers read it. I love it. I still have this letter. It isn't a form letter. I got back saying, this is really a good book. We like this, but it isn't about an officer. So that told me I need to get this published, by golly. This is a sailor, and he was just as important as any officer, as far as I was concerned.
So I heard you, that sounds like you're suggesting the editor was pushing you toward a marketing concept, write about a famous person or get more celebrity component to it.
Well, they were in Annapolis, right?
Right. And what do you use? Microsoft Word? What kind of process do you use?
Microsoft Word, correct.
And when you write, do you touch type first of all?
Yes, I do.
And so you write a piece, and then later on you come back and fiddle with it some more? Or do you try to get the whole thing outlined?
So many times. I must have fiddled with it 100 times. Like this last book, I about 50 times I've gone over this last book. I couldn't wait to get it out of my out of my life for a little while.
And when you go to the publisher, what size of print runs can somebody get printed these days?
You know, the book that you have on the Great White Fleet has a different print than the book that is published and the book that will be published. My publisher happens to be an artist herself. And so when she lays out a book, it's wonderful, as you see when you open that book. So she creates and selects the print to kind of fit.
Who's the target audience? Who do you think is going to like the book? Is this for adults, not for kids, for high school kids, for what?
This book, of course, that's what every publisher asks. And who is your audience? Historians, naval people, also high school, college. I've given talks to historical societies, genealogical societies, also anybody that'll have me. Like I say, I teach a 6-week course through SOU, Southern Oregon University, dealing with this, because in almost all history books, this particular period of history, you're lucky if you get 1 paragraph. And so this is a way for me to teach other people, or at least to open their eyes that there's another piece of history that few of us know about.
Wonderful. So we've enjoyed visiting today with Leslie Compton, author of Dear Minnie, about Roosevelt's Great White Fleet and cruise around the world. It's been wonderful to be speaking with you, Leslie. And with that, we adjourn the Wednesday Yachting
Thank you.
Luncheon.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
How totally fun. Come up and look at the book. It's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Johnny boy, we do need more people.
My grandfather was on the USS New Jersey, which I think was in the fleet.
Yes, yes, yes.